back to the Triple M Show, episode number 9. So for this one, I think we're going to get back into reader questions a little bit because it's been a while. And in answering this particular reader question, we are going to hopefully debunk a bit of a sacred cow or like a popular myth about that's common in personal finance. And that's the myth of the emergency fund. So it's best personified by the following question from Stephen Tamang. To Triple M, assuming no debt, good income, say 50% of the way to financial independence, how much cash should I keep as an emergency fund? 12 thumbs up on that one, so a lot of people are having the same question. And I see that Matt B has stepped in and said, I'd personally recommend 6 months of expenses. Some would say 3 months or as much as a year. So as you can see, we are already all over the map. People don't know how much money they should be keeping as an emergency fund and whether it should be a tiny amount or a long amount, and they're confused on whether or not the debt or the income or how much you already have saved plays into it. So it's interesting that there is so much confusion. And I think where this comes from is competing financial advisors that have been around much longer than Mr. Money Mustache. So here's what happened. I stumbled my own way into financial independence, not even knowing that there was such thing as financial advice. I was just sort of like a naive Canadian man that comes into the US system and starts making a lot of money and couldn't really spend it all, and then ended up with enough to retire on. Then I started writing about personal finance, and then I noticed there's all these other people like Suze Orman and Dave Ramsey, and they have the concept of this emergency fund. And the idea of the emergency fund is it's just cash in your checking account, money, and it prevents you from going back into debt. That's why these advisors are suggesting it, because they are targeting kind of a beginner level of personal finance, which to be honest is most people in the United States and other countries. But the Mr. Money Mustache way is we're more like an advanced personal finance class. So Dave Ramsey and Suze Orman are telling people how to get out of debt, people who have had like unpaid credit cards and car loans and all this stuff for a long time. And they're trying to even figure out how to do that. I'd never experienced debt myself, again, being naive like this. So in my perspective, that's just like below the zero line, and that's the starting line of financial independence. So if you have debt right now, that's an emergency. You should be like, as I mentioned in maybe episode 3, it is an emergency. You can't be buying anything if you don't even have like your car paid off or your credit cards paid off. Like, we're not even talking about budgeting stuff. We're just talking about like living in mom and dad's basement and eating potatoes and certainly not having any children or having any fun until the debt's gone. Now, above that, that's when we start making decisions on like what to do with the money that we actually have. Now, that's a little bit of a hardline stance, and really you could think of it as more of a spectrum like this. We're going to put a graphic up on the screen, but you can call it the money spectrum. Now, in the money spectrum, we have a green line in the middle, which is sort of the zero net worth. And if you slide down below that middle line, you can see increasingly bad types of debt, such as a mortgage. Not too bad. That's the least bad type of debt because it's typically owing money on an appreciating asset, which is your house, and you might be paying about 4% interest on that, and that interest might even be tax deductible. Not so much these days, but that was one of the old excuses. And then the next level down, you got the student loan debt, which is often around a 6% or higher interest rate, not quite as good, and thus more of an emergency. Car loans are even worse. They don't always have high interest rates like 8%, but they're on such a rapidly depreciating thing, being a car, that it's kind of more an emergency, because if you didn't even have enough money to buy a car in the first place, chances are you couldn't afford a car. So I think of that as more of an emergency. To fix that up, sliding down even further, you got credit card debt, which is often at 16 or 20% or more. And then, of course, the worst kind of debt you can imagine would be like you owe money to a homicidal loan shark who's going to take your family or break your kneecaps if they don't get paid back at this 25% or higher interest rate. And in fact, I feel like US pawn shops and payday lenders are a little bit in this category too. They have like a little fee system that looks corporate and honest, but when you work it out on an annualized basis, sometimes these are more than 100% annual interest. Like we'll lend you money until Friday and you get your paycheck and that'll be a $20 fee. Well, $20 fee multiplied by 52 weeks in a year is like over $1,000 on a small amount of money that you're borrowing. So that's terrible stuff. Now going up on the other side of the money spectrum, you could have cash, which is earning 0%, whether it's under your mattress or in a standard checking account, you make no money on this. So it's neither good nor bad. It's going to erode away with inflation, but it's not too bad. Savings account might pay 2%, bonds might pay 3%, stocks are typically going to return 7% per year in appreciation and dividends. And then you can go even further if you own a good business or you own rental houses, maybe even with a little bit of leverage, and you can make 10% or more on your investments. So depending on where you put your money, that's how good or bad it is. And the financial advisors, the Dave Ramsey, Suze Orman types, are saying put a lot in this middle position, the cash and checking account at 0%. The question is, why would you want to do that if you could be up in these big green categories making a lot more money? So that's what we can figure out right now, and that's how we can figure out what the right amount is to put in the 0% bucket. It looks like we need to wait for the sun to go down because we're burning in the sun right now. So we can begin with the ideal answer, sort of the mathematically correct, big picture math answer, and that is 0. So the ideal amount to have in your emergency fund in a perfect world is $0. Now, of course, that is like kind of impractical because how are you going to pay for your credit card bills or withdraw money from the bank for any other reason if there's nothing in there? So the next best thing is to have just enough to cover your monthly expenses that are going to be automatically paid, like your credit card and any kind of automatic withdrawal stuff that you would have for a mortgage or any other dues that are coming out of your bank account each month. And that's exactly what I did when I was a working guy working in engineering, is I would have about $2,000, which was like sort of the monthly expenses in the checking account. And then when you get paid, every time a paycheck comes in, that would go in and boost the amount. Every time you have your credit card automatically pay itself, that shrinks the amount. And of course, most of the time you have more money than you spent. So then the extra amount, I would rake that off of the top and throw it into investments one way or the other, or sometimes paying down the mortgage. It all depends on what strategy you're doing with your spare cash. Now, why is this a big deal is the next question. Well, if you think about it, most of these advisors are saying you should keep 6 months or even a year's living expenses in your emergency fund. If you think about that, though, if you have annual expenses of, let's say, $40,000 and you keep 6 months of expenses in your account, that is sacrificing all the money that you would have earned for $20,000, which is about $1,400 a year, or like $150 plus per month that's getting sacrificed just from like making you feel safe, and it's not really doing anything in there. And if you work out the math on that, that's like losing that $120 a month of investment returns, which is more than $10,000, just looking at my notes here, more than $20,000 per decade that emergency fund is costing you. So you don't want to do that unless you have to do it. And then of course that brings the next question, like, okay, what if I really have an emergency, like my spending is bigger than expected? So this is the first thing. And if you have like a Mustachian, financial independence oriented lifestyle, your expenses are like this and your earnings are like this. So typically your expenses are going to be 50% or even less than 50% of your income. So the definition of an emergency is like you spend more than you expected one month, right? So your expenses might go up to this, right? You're still earning this much, so you just don't save quite as much that month. And the next month, the emergency is gone, like you've paid for your water heater or paid for your medical bills or whatever, and then you're back to saving this much. And then, okay, what if you have a really big expense that's more than your monthly surplus? Well, then you just go up to that higher category of stocks and sell some of your investment accounts, just a few shares here and there, and chuck that money into your checking account to cover whatever the bill was. Let's say you decided to buy a new car one month and it was like $10,000 or $15,000. You bought yourself a super nice car for Craigslist, and you didn't have that much out of the monthly surplus, and you're ignoring Mr. Money Mustache's advice to ride the bike most of the time. Well, that's easy. You just sell a few shares, put that money into your bank account, and you're still covered. So you don't really need an emergency fund. And if you're doing all your spending on credit cards, which is what I advise to begin with, then you have more than a month of notice between when you make the purchase and when you actually have to pay it off. So this doesn't work if you're not disciplined. It doesn't work if you're always getting yourself into debt and like, oops, I just realized I have a $3,000 credit card bill and I only make $600 a month. So people with that situation, they need to go back to the beginner training wheels stuff of like a bigger emergency fund and like sort of budgets and monthly buckets and everything like that. But For advanced mustachians, I would say you keep your checking account lean and you think of your savings, your investment account, as your emergency fund. Okay, one last little trick, which is kind of like the bonus material or the extra advanced thing for extra credit. So if you are a homeowner and you have a mortgage, or even if you have a paid off house, you can do something that's even better than the cash cushion, which is what I call springy debt. So if you have a house, it's good to have a line of credit on that house, ideally with kind of a zero balance most of the time. And sometimes you can even take a mortgage if you don't have a very big mortgage and just replace that with a line of credit instead on your house with an existing balance. Those little details don't really matter, but what really matters is that this is a magical debt account that you can write checks against whenever you need to borrow money. And then whenever you have extra money, you feed it back into that account, which reduces your indebtedness. And then you can keep your checking account nice and small. Then you continue earning money, continue making investments, continue keeping the checking account small. And then whenever you want to make a bigger bunch of spending, whether that is buying a car or buying a rental house, putting a down payment on a rental house, or doing other stuff that requires a lot of money, you don't have to sell your shares. You can leave those invested, which helps you avoid any kind of capital gains, taxes at unexpected times. And instead, you just write a check from your line of credit and fund this whatever you're buying. And you just borrow the minimum amount because it's only what you put on the check. And then your subsequent paychecks go back into reducing your indebtedness in that line of credit, get it back up to zero, and then you're at the zero balance again. And it's just a nice way to run your life because you're really minimizing the interest that you're paying on debt of your house while maximizing your sort of like liquidity in case you want to do any big moves with money. And that's pretty much it for this episode about the emergency fund and the cash cushion and the money spectrum. Hopefully all this stuff makes sense and you can apply it in your own life. And maybe you can tell me what you think about all this in the comments. Do you agree or disagree? Am I missing something? Of course, I don't think I'm missing anything because I've been doing this strategy for like 20 years now, but I'd love to see why people are so in favor of the big emergency fund or the big cash cushion in all different levels of wealth, because I never quite understood it myself, but I still see it being pushed a lot, even among my fellow financial independence bloggers. So I'd love to see where the controversy is. See you next time.